Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another live stream. It's your host, Danny Dhaiphong, and as you can see, I am joined for a mega roundtable today to discuss all things Putin-Trump phone call and geopolitics, the shockwaves that are being sent across the world as Donald Trump's foreign policy takes shape. With me today, I have Larry Johnson, former CIA analyst, geopolitical analyst now. How are you, Larry?
I am well. Thank you for having me.
I also have Ray McGovern. He's also a former CIA analyst. He is also a co-founder of the Veterans for Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, which I know Larry's also a part of. And he's also a frequent contributor and geopolitical analyst as well. Ray, how are you?
Good.
And then we have Glenn Diesen back on the show. Good to have him, geopolitical analyst. He, I know that he's a frequent traveler on the Duran, as well as his own YouTube show. Glenn, thanks so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for having me on.
Yeah, so everybody hit the like button as we get started. That helps boost this video in YouTube's algorithm. And we are just going to dive right in. So, gentlemen, in the wake of the Putin-Trump phone call that followed Witkoff's visit to Russia, Donald Trump made a dire plea to Vladimir Putin in Russia about Kursk. And I wanted to play this and then Putin's response, which has caused some hysteria in the West. Here is what Donald Trump had to say about Kursk.
First of all, you don't want to pick on somebody that's a lot larger than you, even with the money. There's a lot of money that we gave them and a lot of equipment, the best military equipment in the world. But even with all of that, it's unbelievable. Right now, you have a lot of Ukrainian soldiers that are encircled and in grave danger. And I've asked them not to kill those soldiers, please, not to kill those soldiers. We don't want them killed. It's such a shame to see what's happened. A thing like that would have never happened.
So that's what Donald Trump had to say about Kursk. And now I want to play what Vladimir Putin had to say in response to this plea by Donald Trump. Here we go.
I'd like to note that the Ukrainian militants have perpetrated multiple war crimes against the civilian population. And the General Prosecutor's Office of the Russian Federation deems this terrorism. And we understand President Trump's appeal to be guided by humanitarian considerations with regard to these military personnel. I'd like to underscore that if they surrender, if they put down their arms, they will be guaranteed a due treatment in accordance with international law and the laws of the Russian Federation.
So, Larry, let me ask you first. Vladimir Putin has essentially ordered Ukraine to surrender in Kursk, and the battlefield situation looks very grim for Ukraine. Donald Trump is pleading to Putin in Russia not to destroy these troops. What do you make of this? Because Zelensky is saying this isn't happening. There's a lot, and then there's very conflicting reports coming out of NATO as well about whether Ukraine is in as much trouble as is being told by both Trump and Russia. Your thoughts about all of this?
Well, there was another, if you would have continued the recording of Vladimir Putin, he then added the other caveat that it would require the authorities in Kiev, Zelensky, Syrsky, the commanding general, to order the troops to surrender. If they issue that order and the troops surrender, they're going to be handled in accordance with the Geneva Convention under international law. It's still a question whether that will apply to foreign mercenaries. Putin's been very clear that foreign mercenaries are not considered legitimate combatants covered by the Geneva Convention, and has authorized Russian troops to execute them, and they have been executing the foreigners. So this again, I think, was what I'd call some clever, sophisticated diplomacy on the part of Putin, where he can present to the outward world that he's willing to soften the orders that he had issued the day before in Kursk. Because remember, he went to Kursk for, this is, I think, the second time since the start of the special military operation, not second time since he went to Kursk, the second time that he donned military camouflage gear to dressed as a military commander, and issued direct orders to Gerasimov and his commanders to finish the job quickly in Kursk, and to show, if you will, no mercy to those terrorists that have carried out rapes and murders of Russian citizens. So, I think it's just, the war is going to continue, and it remains to be seen if any of those 5,000 to 7,000 Ukrainian soldiers that are caught in the cauldron will surrender and turn themselves over to Russia. So we'll have a repeat of the surrender at Mariupol.
Ray, I wanted to ask you now as well, what do you make of this, given that, this came right after a phone call between Putin and Trump, and it was essentially Donald Trump saying that Russia should not continue to go forward in Kursk, even though the situation is wrapping up there. Can you describe that situation? And given your expertise in intelligence, what does all of this tell you about the overall situation?
It tells me, Danny, that we have to be really attentive to open sources and do simple things like keep track of what happened first. Putin said this on Thursday. That's the day that Witkoff arrived in Moscow, accompanied by a shower of Ukrainian drone attacks. Okay, not the first one that week. Okay, what did he do? Well, Putin was in Kursk in dress battle array, which you can see in a very, very formidable interview where he took a situation description from Gerasimov, his chief of staff, general staff, and then he told him, "Look, I want this thing finished. I want it finished as soon as possible." And believe me, we've got him in a cauldron, and under Russian law, they're terrorists. They're terrorists. So we want to finish them off as soon as we can, as soon as possible. Now, Putin gets back to Moscow, and I guess he had trouble taking his camouflage uniform off because he kept Witkoff waiting for several hours. People say 3 to 7 hours that Witkoff was cooling his heels, waiting to see Putin. Putin eventually accepts the conversation with him, but I'm sure what he said is, "Hey, Steve, what are these guys? What's a Rubio and this guy Keller? Who am I supposed to listen to here? You have the ear of the president. We just tell the president that if he looks at the situation, we have no incentive for an immediate 3 to 30 days. Give me a break. Who cooked this thing up? What we're going to do is continue. And by the way, tell the president that we got those 10,000 or so Ukrainian troops surrounded in Kursk. And, he ought to think about that, because these crazy Ukrainians are going to ask them to try to fight it out. They're all going to die, okay? So, Steve Witkoff either gets on the plane, he calls the president, he says, he's pretty hard-nosed with me. It took me 6 hours to get in to see him. And he said, look, by the way, I don't pay any attention to Rubio and these other guys. This can't be a ceasefire. And I'm really worried about what I'm going to do to these poor Ukrainian guys that are surrounded. So, that's the next step, Mr. President. You want me to finish them off? I think that's what happened. So what happens is Trump goes on the phone and says, "Oh, please don't finish him off." Then he makes a little press conference. He said, I've asked Putin, please don't kill all those people. And Putin says the next day, look, don't you remember what I said before? They're terrorists, but we heed the president of the United States. we will show them every respect and every consideration consistent with international law and Russian law as well. So what's going to happen? This is really interesting. What is Putin going to do? And what is, there's a trade here. There's a trade-off. What will Putin require for treating these people in a way that, quite frankly, as Larry has pointed out, they don't deserve to be treated, having invaded Russia as they did and terrorized a lot of those small villages.
Glenn, I want to bring you in here because what do you think of what Ray said? I mean, Kursk, it's an occupation, it's an invasion from Ukraine, and Russia is on the precipice of completely retaking it. So what do you make of the calculations here, and perhaps the bigger geopolitical context from which this dire plea from Trump falls?
Well, I think on one hand they do realize that the negotiations, that Trump being more understanding of Russia's situation, that this is something they've never seen before, or at least for decades, from any Western leaders, that is recognizing that NATO expansion was a concern, was a threat, and this is why Russia responded, and even pointing out that this is what triggered the war. So they don't want to waste this either. And indeed, my impression is that Putin and, well, the Russians overall, they want this war to get over with. But of course, any temporary ceasefire won't do. This is seen as being simply another Minsk agreement, that is some time to rearm Ukraine and then start everything over again. So they weren't going to do this, but it all happens, as you said, in the context of what is playing out in Kursk. And it's worth noting that it's limited how much they can bend towards Trump as well. Keep in mind, as Ray pointed out very correctly, this was an occupation of Russia. There was a lot of war crimes committed. This has been going on for many months now. The Russians lost a lot of soldiers to liberated cities. So again, it's always worth putting yourself in the shoes of the other side. And obviously, there's a lot of resentment going on. And it's not as if this was only a Ukrainian mission. It's very hard to imagine that the Western countries did not know about this in advance. Indeed, I find it very difficult to believe that many of the NATO countries didn't support this actively. Indeed, we've had intelligence chiefs from Britain, the U.S. They met, was back in September, where they were celebrating what a great move this was because they changed the narrative. We had political leaders. I pointed out before that most tasteless one is perhaps the Germans. They had, I think, 2 generals by now who has said how wonderful this is. This is a good way of humiliating Putin. This is where the Germans last time also had an important battle against the Russians. I mean, this is really nasty stuff we've been saying playing out in the media. So again, put yourself in the shoes of the Russians. They see this occupation with war crimes, which has been done with Western support. So, well, what can Putin do, which is reasonable at this point? And obviously, they don't want to blow off Trump again, given that they see possibly or finally a partner which they can possibly, I guess, negotiate a new European security architecture and address the underlying issues of this war. But the whole point of a ceasefire, it's something they couldn't do. Keep in mind, Putin is also he's, despite what we're saying, he's not a dictator. He has a political class. He has a public. You can't just suddenly accept a ceasefire in which there's no possible political solution, and something has to come from this. And also, even if he was a dictator, what sense does this make? You really need to first address key issues. For example, if you're going to announce a ceasefire tomorrow, exactly who's going to observe this? At some point, someone's going to fire missiles or artillery grenades at each other, or there's going to be some shooting. There can't be possibly any scenario where the Europeans, for example, would say, yes, the Ukrainian began this. I mean, whatever happens, the Russians can have the dam blow up, you can Nord Stream blow up, you can have drones hitting the Kremlin. Every time the Europeans keep saying, well, it's just the Russians attacking themselves, because this is in the Russian playbook. So even if there would be a ceasefire, it would most likely be broken. The Russians would get the blame for it, and there would be pressure on the Trump administration to push through. And then to put more pressure on Russia. So I think this is the main thought they had. We have to deal with things like who's going to observe this. What's going to be done during this month? Is it just going to be a month without a political settlement at the end? Is it just going to be to rearm Ukraine as they're being chased out of Kursk? There has to be some kind of a thought behind this, and they haven't seen it. But again, I think the wise thing to do was to acknowledge that this ceasefire, it was also a way to get the Ukrainians to closer towards the negotiation table. Because as we saw in the Oval Office, Zelensky be quite reluctant. Even Yermak, on this very same day he met the Americans, he had a long list of demands in order to accept a ceasefire. They all disappeared. So something has been done. They have been brought closer. So if you see this as part of a process that is obviously wasn't going to end with a take it or leave it, then I think this could be seen as something positive. But I think the Europeans were hoping that this would be take it or leave it, because if you looked in the European media, there was a lot of excitement. Now, yes, now Putin either accept this, which they know he can't. Otherwise, it's time for Trump to sanction the hell out of Russia and come over to our side. With the more warmongers who want to continue the Biden policies of a forever war with the Russians. So I think it was a good way to handle it, but I don't see how it could have played out much different than what it did.
Larry, I know you've probably seen the videos of what has been happening in Kursk, the massive the surrendering of massive numbers of Ukrainian troops in the villages that have been retaken as that as the pocket that Ukraine occupies now gets smaller and smaller. But Zelensky and Ukraine as a whole, they're not showing, as Glenn just said, are there any signs of this kind of actual literal surrender? In Kursk, even, not really. This is what Volodymyr Zelensky said on X. I just want to go down to where he references Kursk. A separate note on the Kursk region. The operation of our forces in the designated areas of Kursk continues. The units are carrying out their tasks as required. Thanks to the forces in the Kursk region, a significant number of Russian forces were withdrawn from other directions. Our troops continue to hold back Russian and North Korean groupings in the Kursk region. There is no encirclement of our troops. Is Ukraine correct here? Because in the West, you have UK media, Mr. Kemp, the neocon, former naval commander, I believe, he is saying that it's lost. And then you have others in the West that are saying, no, Zelensky's exactly right. So what's exactly going on here, Larry?
This is Downfall 2, the first Downfall movie, recorded Hitler's last days in the bunker in Berlin as the Soviets closed in and finished him off. He was delusional. Now Zelensky is playing that same role. He doesn't quite have the postage stamp mustache. He's not getting married to Eva Braun, but he's equally crazy and delusional, completely detached from reality. But, we've seen these kinds of denials before. If you recall, in May of 2022, when the Russians surrounded the Ukrainian units in Mariupol at the Avastal steel plant, the facility, they denied that the Russians had the upper hand, and continued to deny it even until the day that they marched the surviving Ukrainians out and forced them to strip and surrendered them, and then took them off to a prisoner of war camp. So, I think that was likely going to happen here. These kinds of denials by Ukrainian leaders doesn't change the situation on the battlefield, and it doesn't help their credibility in the West. So it's just, it's a form of macabre political theater.
Yeah, Ray, your response.
I want to quote Ayn Rand. Quote, we can ignore reality. it's possible for us to ignore reality, but one cannot ignore the consequences of ignoring reality. Okay? End quote.
Yeah.
Well, the consequences of ignoring reality are going to be really, really steep right now. The Ukrainians seem to be above the battle, out of the picture, delusional, as are their European allies. Their European allies are led by pygmies, people who have bubbled to the top through political struggle domestically. They don't know what to do. And so the consequences are great. As long as they continue to be delusional and realize that there's nothing they can do about these thousands of troops in Kursk other than to let them die or let them be captured. Well, the sooner they realize that, the better. But it doesn't look like they're going to realize it. So here is Putin trying to decide, okay, what do I do now? One last call to Trump. Donald, my old friend, you better tell Volodymyr Zelensky to tell his troops to surrender by Tuesday, or they're all going to be dead. Okay, that's they're in our country, for God's sake. They should surrender. You tell them that, and it's Tuesday. That's what we're going to do it. That's what Putin probably will do. What will Trump do then? Well, he'll just say, well, like I said before, and this is Trump's strong card. And he started out that little clip with it. He said, this is crazy to think like a small country like Ukraine could defeat a great big country on its border like Russia. I never would have allowed that. Well, I believe that's probably the case. I never would have got into that. Okay. But why did they get into it? Well, Obama said exactly the same thing. President Obama, 2015, it would be criminal for us to give the Ukrainians the idea they could prevail in a battle against a much stronger Russia on their doorstep. A little codicil here. When he said that, there was a deputy secretary of state said, Mr. President, you're absolutely right, because if we gave Ukraine lethal weaponry, the Russians could match it, they could double it, they could triple it, they could quadruple it, end quote. Who was that Deputy Secretary of State? Antony Blinken. So that was 2015, okay? Fast forward to 2022, and you have Tony Blinken telling a very impaired president, look, we can do this. Yeah, we can do that. And besides, we're gonna weaken Russia in the process. And Biden said, we can? Oh my God, that's great, because we're exceptional. We can do anything we want. So that's the way this thing went down. And what Trump explains to the American people, as he has already acknowledged, I can understand why the Russians wouldn't like a country armed to the gills with NATO installations that's right on there. Well, I can understand that. Well, that's 80% of the problem fixed right there. The rest is just working out the nuances, as Putin said the other day.
Right, and Glenn, your final thoughts on the significance of this Kursk plea geopolitically. Where do you see things heading as we move deeper and deeper into U.S. Russia talks, but really into this conflict, which has not ceased? There is no ceasefire, and as Ray has said very eloquently, and as you have also said, it was a non-starter.
Yeah, well, exactly. So I think the way the Russians handled it worked out for the best. Again, when Trump gave a press conference, he has pointed out that Putin respects America, so this is important. He also argued he supported the Russian account of things, the fact that a lot of Ukrainian soldiers have been surrounded. What Zelensky disputes and Putin has argued. But I think most people can tell what has happened. So he also supported this, and also he made the comment, which Ray argued, that a small country, well, another smaller, but a country like Ukraine, it was foolish to pick a fight with a larger country like Russia. Now, this is quite important in many ways. For one of these issues is the whole idea that this was an unprovoked invasion. I think this is very important, and I often make this point because I think this is at the foundation of all of these flawed narratives, and there are a lot of dangerous narratives. There's a large extent been a war of narratives as well, because once we said that this was an unprovoked war, it became immoral to negotiate. It became immoral to meet halfway. You shouldn't be allowed to understand the opposing side. Even discussing the Russian security concerns was a form of, appeasing Hitler, or looking away from their imperial ambitions, and all of this nonsense. So I very much agree with what was just said, because once you accept that that is our side contributed to provoking this war, although Trump very conveniently puts it at the feet of Biden, but I don't think this is correct. This has been going on for over a decade now. But nonetheless, once you recognize the opponent's security concerns, how we have contributed to provoking this war, then now there's suddenly a scope for actually having a compromise. That's why I thought the Russian reaction and then the reaction by Washington was so important. And I keep seeing recognitions for this from Washington now as well. Marco Rubio keeps making this comment as well, that we can't just slander the Russians and only talk to people who we agree 100% with. The fact that the United States could vote on the side of Russia on Ukraine, vote in the UN also on the side over the issue of Syria. A lot of this is completely new, and it's quite groundbreaking. So I think this is a very important new path, and I don't know how it could have gone any better. Again, Putin could never accept the ceasefire without anything being observed, and no political solution, and not even any plan over this 30 days. It would have been ridiculous. And again, unlike the Europeans, the Russians can't just keep bowing and hoping that they will get respect. They can't show that much weakness either. So I think this was the best approach, and it looks like the United States wants to deal with this as not as a take it or leave it rejection and then go after the Russians, but instead perhaps as one step towards further into this to the longer process of finding a settlement. But as Hegseth said in the beginning of this, we accept the principle, the main three objectives here, or the demands of the Russians: no NATO expansion, have to accept some territorial concessions, and there can't be any security guarantees. So these things have to be built into some kind of a settlement as well. And I think that the Trump administration should understand that. And from what I'm hearing Trump saying, it sounds like he does understand it as well.
Well, let's pivot now, because I wanted to talk about almost the exact point that you're making, Glenn, about whether Trump understands this, because we do see major contradictions. On the one hand, there is this major push to negotiations. It is serious, and there's no doubt that it is happening. Trump-Putin phone calls, numerous of them, numerous times we've had diplomats, Witkoff, for example, travel to Russia. But then we have policies that have just been announced by the Trump administration. For example, sending small, what are they called? Ground launch small diameter bombs, long range weapons, as well as the exemption now that the Trump administration has let pass on specific energy transactions for Russia. So tightening the screws on sanctions. And then the G7, Marco Rubio was just at the G7, the defunct and essentially completely outmoded institution. But he was there, and they came up with a statement that Russia will face sanctions if it doesn't accept a ceasefire to this conflict. Larry, what do you make of these contradictions? Because on the one hand, I see a serious push for negotiations. On the other, I also see potential moves that hinder the process of a peace settlement. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, it's the absence of any kind of strategy in the part of the West. And, the idea that there's some sanctions that they have yet to impose on Russia, that when they impose them, Russians are going to go, oh my God, yeah, we better surrender right away because the West is so strong. It's nonsense. Russia solidified its relationship with China now 3 years ago. And it was in direct response to the Western sanctions, where Russia finally realized, after years, it's as if Russia was in a relationship with an abusive spouse, that Mother Russia was the wife and the West was the drunken wife beater. And by God, man, we kept smacking her around for years. We kept coming home drunk, kept throwing up on the carpet. And Russia still managed to put up with it until February of 2022, when Putin recognized, this is going to stop. And even then, I think Putin held out hope that by starting the special military operation, it would force the West to come to their senses. And they were fully prepared. Russia was fully prepared to negotiate a quick end to that special military operation. That they even, and I heard this from Foreign Minister Lavrov on Monday, where he said, look, the deal that we signed off on in Istanbul in April of 2022, that came from the Ukrainians. So the Russians were willing even to accept a Ukrainian proposal to bring an end to that conflict. And what happened? It was blown up by the West. So from that point on, Russia's realized there's no relationship with the West. They can come back and promise, honey, I'm never going to do it again. Honey, I'm going to go see a therapist. Honey, I'm going to attend Alcoholics Anonymous. That's all over. This relationship is broken in terms of the dependence that once existed. Russia would be willing to deal with the West, but it's going to be dealing with the West at arm's length distance, where it's not going to be dependent upon Western banking systems. It's not going to be dependent upon Western currency. It's not going to allow itself to be in a position where Western sanctions can cripple or hurt Russia. Russia's it's got the resources, it's got the wealth, it's got the technological skill, that it doesn't need a single thing that the West has to offer. And in contrast to that, here's the United States wanting to throw around and impose sanctions, yet Russia and China combined control over 90% of the antimony in the world. Antimony is a rare earth mineral, which is a critical, essential component for the production of artillery shells. With that being cut off by Russia and China, the United States doesn't have an alternative to turn to. So they can talk a big game about producing all these artillery shells for Ukraine to use against Russia, but the fact of the matter is they don't have the essential materials needed. So these kinds of threats emanating from Washington and from the G7, for starters, Russia doesn't take Europe seriously at all. They view them as a team of dwarf poodles, little yappy dogs that have no teeth, make a lot of annoying noise, but represent no threat. The United States is in a different category, but there again, the United States is not in a position to coerce or force Russia to do anything. Russia is going to preserve and pursue its own national interests. And the United States will either have to come to recognize and accept that, or pay the price, as Ray referred to, that you can ignore reality, but then at some point you have to, the consequences of ignoring reality are going to hit you.
Ray, I definitely want to bring you in here because it's exactly what Larry said. I mean, I've seen Russia react to all of this just very, very well. I believe they've done an incredible job navigating this kind of Trump storm that we have been witnessing, this push for negotiations, but also these policies, which have many contradictions to them, as Larry pointed out. So what is your take of this moment, and how do these contradictions factor into, because there's a lot of enthusiasm about this peace process, how do they factor into it? What do you make of it?
Well, I think one thing that needs to be mentioned is that Putin himself is under considerable pressure. He has admitted, I was too trusting. I was naive. The promise of not 1 inch east of Eastern Europe for NATO, the business about replacing Yanukovych government in Kiev, all these things, Minsk 1, Minsk 2, and then the Istanbul Accord, where we thought we had a deal. We did have a deal. We had a deal with Zelensky's best buddy, for God's sake. He headed the delegation. And now his best buddy is saying, yeah, we had a deal. I initialed it, but Boris Johnson came in at the behest of the U.S. and the U.K. and put the kibosh on it. So betrayal is what Putin is aware of, more so his generals and his admirals looking over his shoulder. Vladimir, don't let him take you in again. So does that mean that there's no chance for an agreement on Ukraine? No, it doesn't. I think trust is gone. We can't say doverai no proverai anymore. Trust but verify. How about just agree but verify? Okay. Now you can't tell me that any kind of situation that we worked out, ceasefire or whatever, cannot be effectively verified with the combined means, national technical means, we used to call them, the satellites and everything else, of such sophistication that we would know almost immediately about violations of an agreement, not a trust, okay? So it's possible to do that. And what needs to happen is, in my view, the American people need to be educated to the fact that this is the case, that it is history, that this was not unprovoked on the part of Putin. It was provoked, and we have the Secretary General of the NATO admitting that in May of 2023. He said, Putin said, you keep trying to get Ukraine in NATO, we will have to invade. We said no, and so he invaded. I mean, hello, how clear do you need to be? So it was not unprovoked. And the next adjective usually is full scale invasion, right? Full scale. All right. Well, most people think about 90,000 troops that went up there near Kiev, and their purpose was to scare the hell out of Zelensky. Did they do that? Yeah, they did do that. Did Zelensky come to terms? Yeah, he sent his best friends to Istanbul to come to terms. Okay, that's what happened. It was a full-scale invasion. So once the American people realized that not only was it not a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but that the Russians don't want any part of occupying all of Ukraine, that would be crazy. That would be a Vietnam for them. Nor do they want Poland, nor do they want the Baltic states. For God's sake, don't believe people like Biden, who's been told by Blinken and Sullivan to say these things. They're not true. So I look with optimism, and I'm prompted to note that yesterday, the events after Witkoff came back from Moscow were greeted by cautious optimism on the part of Peskov, the presidential spokesman, Putin's spokesman. And Trump said they were productive. So despite all this stuff, despite all this ineptitude on the part of the State Department and NSC and this guy Kellogg, there's communication between Putin and Trump, and that's what's going to solve all this. And as I said before, the kernel is already solved. Once Trump recognizes, as he already did, that Russia's core concerns, national security concerns, existential concerns in Ukraine are the same as ours were in Cuba in 1962. If Trump understands that, then I believe he'll have a willing partner to work out something that allows for properly verified, not trust, but an agreement written on paper blessed by the UN Security Council if possible, but it doesn't need that. People need to be held accountable. Sophisticated collection of intelligence enables that to happen. That's possible, and I wait in hope that in the next couple of months that will be doable and concluded.
Glenn, you have studied Russia. You have a very deep understanding of Russia. I know that you have even asked a question at the Valdai group, right, to Vladimir Putin himself. From your understanding of Russia, have you seen them maneuvering these contradictions of the Trump, I guess you could say, attempt at negotiations, both genuine and, of course, the contradictions we have noted here? What have you made of how Russia's been dealing with this and how it will move forward, given what Ray just said?
Well, first it should be said that the reason why there's some optimism is that the Russians and the Americans appear to want the same thing. That is, if we assume that Trump is genuine, that he wants to end this war, and I think most people accept this, then there should be possible to get something done. I think the problem over the past many years is that they didn't actually have a partner on the other side. Now they do see that they have one, but there's still some concerns because if it was just up to Trump, I think there would be more reason to be optimistic. But at the same time, you have the rest of the American political establishment. You have Zelensky. Of course, he could be pushed aside. But then you also have the Europeans. Keep in mind when the Russians and Americans are talking about ending the war, you have the Europeans literally in panic. You have the British Prime Minister Starmer talking about putting together a coalition of the willing to send troops on the ground and really hyping the Russian fear. So it's some concerns whether or not this can actually be pulled off. And so again, this is where the optimism comes from. The pessimism is that Russia's been seen as having betrayed in the past. Keep in mind that already from 1990, we actually signed agreements, that is the Charter of Paris for a new Europe with the Russians, actually the Soviets at that time. But we built on this as well. We had agreements about having a Europe without dividing lines, indivisible security, effectively building on the idea of a common Europe. All of this was betrayed, they see, by the decision to expand NATO, the NATO-Russia Founding Act. We weren't supposed to put troops in the new member states. Now we do. Missile defense. The EU actually made deals as well with the Russians in 2005 for under common space agreement. We're going to harmonize our positions towards the common neighborhood. Don't enhance your security or promote integration without doing it with the other side. Well, we walked away from that only a few months afterwards. Had the reset as well, as remember under the Obama administration, only to have Libya happen thereafter. We had the Minsk agreement for 7 years, and this was also betrayed. Istanbul, I mean, the list really goes on. So they have a lot of reasons why they don't trust us anymore. And I spoke actually last night to Dmitry Polyansky, the permanent representative of the Russian Federation to the United Nations. And I actually asked him the same question, and he said, do you think this is going to work out? And the main reply was simply that, well, this is an issue of existential threat, so they set out their goals. And this has to be achieved. It would be as if, telling the Americans, okay, we're just going to have Russia can only have a few missiles in Mexico and a couple of bases. There's not that much leeway on the core issues where they can actually compromise. So given that this is an existential issue, they see it in simple terms. That is, we will get this done with our military. However, if we have a partner, someone who wants to end the war and find a political solution, then of course that's much better. Imagine all the lives which could be saved. This has been really an unnecessary war. I mean, really unnecessary. If we had told the Russians 3 years ago there will be no NATO expansion, there would have been no war. Now, 3 years later, it's accepted. Okay, there won't be any NATO expansion. Hundreds of thousands of deaths later on, all of this could have been avoided. So, again, there's a lot of optimism and hope that things can be done with the United States, but they're not going to gamble everything on this. So there's a lack of trust, I guess. But still, I have to point out there's also optimism. As I started off saying, they haven't seen anyone talk like Trump's talking. Again, recognizing the security concern of your opponent. It shouldn't be a revolutionary thing. This is what diplomacy would be, the first step to put yourself in the shoes of the other guy. But we haven't seen this, at least in the unipolar era. So, there's reasons for optimism.
Yep.
Yeah, and Larry, what Glenn is saying is interesting because I've been acknowledging on this show that it is a very positive step forward that Trump is in this context, because we will talk about other contexts in a bit, regardless of why, regardless of the agenda, it's happening. There are negotiations, and however slow, however contradictory the policies that are kind of surrounding the negotiations it's happening, and it is a positive thing. But on the one hand, a lot of viewers here are saying there's a lot of red flags already. And I wanted to ask you, Larry, how much, given what Glenn said, could we know about Europe, and we're going to get to that soon. We know about NATO. We know about Zelensky as barriers. How much of a barrier could Trump himself pose to the possibility of a peace settlement here, given that there is this lack of trust, honestly, between the two parties, and Russia has been burned before, and the U.S. has talked, and Trump has talked a lot before. So your thoughts?
Well, the Russians are going to be watching what Trump actually does. They're not going to pay much attention to what he says because his mouth is all over the place, and everything, he's not a reliable source. And they're going to watch what he is doing, and not just doing in Ukraine, but doing around the world. So, one of the other things that we haven't talked about yet is that Trump has ordered more hell to be rained down on Yemen, and they're bombing civilian areas in Yemen. And this is one more example that the Russians are going to watch of the United States insisting that it's still this imperial hegemon who can throw its weight around the world and force others to do its will, to submit to it. And that Trump is one of the biggest cheerleaders for that. And yet Trump, in taking those positions, foolishly overestimates the capabilities of the United States to actually back up and deliver on Trump's bombast. The Russians, I think, are genuine in their optimism that they're at least getting a different tone out of Washington, D.C. I had a conversation in December 2023. I was standing next to Pepe Escobar, and we were talking to Sergei Rybkov. Rybkov is the deputy foreign minister in the foreign ministry. And back then he was saying, look, there's no contact with anybody. We don't have any kind of open diplomatic channels with the Biden administration. That condition persisted through the remainder of Biden's term. But then when Trump came in, at least they saw a rekindling of some of the fundamentals of diplomacy. So the Russians are welcoming that. They're going to work with that. They're not going to slam the door and say, get the hell out. We don't want to talk to you anymore. But they're not going to surrender their own national interests. They've, as Ray noted earlier, as Glenn has noted earlier, that there have been too many times over the last 20 years, or let's even go back to 1991, 34 years, where promises for the West have been made and betrayed, and action after action by the West to show that they have no genuine interest in a long-term security arrangement with Russia, just the opposite. The abandonment of the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2001 by George W. Bush, the 2018 abrogation of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty by Donald Trump. So Russia, they're going to talk and hope that they can come up with some concrete agreements with the United States, but they're not going to accept promises. It's going to have to be very clear, well-defined actions. And Russia is hoping that it can achieve peace through that pathway. But barring that, they're going to continue the military operation until Ukraine is crushed and forced to surrender militarily.
Ray, yes. Oh, sorry, you're muted. There you go. You're good now.
I think, Larry, you're absolutely right here. Look, here's the reality. Russia doesn't need a ceasefire, all right? It's the last thing it needs. It's got those troops in Kursk surrounded. It's got this 2,000-kilometer line from the Donbass all the way north, going ahead gradually, attriting the Ukrainian troops. Remember, it's not about conquering territory. It's about demilitarization. That means attriting or killing off or injuring Ukrainian troops. So here's Putin. He's got no incentive to make big concessions, but he is interested in a final settlement. Now, in my view, all Trump has to do is say, you know, Biden was from hunger. Biden, Blinken, Sullivan, these were neophytes. They didn't know what was going on. They forgot that the Soviet Union fell apart and that they didn't want to invade Poland and the Baltic states, much less all of Ukraine. It was very simple. They felt their core interests were endangered. And Obama also said, and Trump could quote him, look, Ukraine is one of Russia's core interests. It's an existential matter for Russia. It's not an existential matter for the U.S., says Obama. So let's not get overextended and make commitments where it's not an existential matter. Obama said all that stuff. So all Trump used to do is say, well, you know, Obama, even though he led this anti-Russian Russiagate stuff and do all kinds of things like throwing out our diplomats and confiscating our property and everything, at least he had the sense to look at the map, for God's sake, and realize that supporting Ukraine to weaken Russia was a fool's errand. Okay, now on the practical side, what the Russians are afraid of are hypersonic missiles, not only in Romania and Poland, which have installations prepared to accept them once the U.S. figures out how to make them. Okay, and that's inevitable. It's a wonder that it takes all up, but they will. Okay, so here's what Putin told his military, his top military, on the 21st of December, 2021. Look, when the Americans get hypersonic missiles, they're not going to put them only in Ukraine and in Poland and Romania, where they already have these sites. They're going to put them in Ukraine. And guess what, military? That will leave me, Vladimir Putin, for 5 minutes to decide whether to blow up the rest of he didn't say blow up the rest of the world. What do I about to? Okay. That was the 21st of December, 2021. Now, a very curious thing happened. 9 days later, the White House gets a call from the Kremlin. President Putin would like to talk to President Biden right away, please. Oh, well, wait a second. This is crazy. We have our negotiators meeting just in 10 days in Geneva. And besides, it's New Year's. Please, right away. Well, to his credit, Biden takes the call, but he's in Delaware without his shepherds, without his acolytes, without Biden and Sullivan, okay? And so when Putin asks him, as I think he was prompted by his military to do, look, Mr. President, we're going to meet in Geneva. We're going to finally have some talks on strategic and other weaponry. If you could just commit not to put offensive strike missiles in Ukraine, man, that would mean the world, because that would really satisfy half of the conditions in that draft treaty. Remember that? Did they tell you about that draft? Oh, well, okay, look it up. There is a draft treaty. It would really make things real smooth when we get to Geneva. So what happens? The readout of that call says the President of the United States agreed that he had no intention of putting offensive strike missiles in Ukraine, period, end quote. So that's the 30th of December, 2021. great rejoicing. Ushakov, who is now coming again to the chief advisor to Putin, says, man, this is great. This is finally they're listening to us. Long story short, 21st of January 2022 now, just a month before the special military operation, Lavrov runs down Tony Blinken. Tony, I see that you're in Geneva. So am I. Let's get together. They get together and Lavrov says, hey, how about that commitment? How about that undertaking that your president made on the 30th of December not to put offensive strike missiles in Ukraine? Let's go. Your negotiators there in Geneva don't seem to have any instructions on that. Blinken, forget about it. We weren't with him. He was at home alone. It was Christmas time. We have the right to put offensive strike missiles in Ukraine, and we're going to do it if the Ukrainians ask us. I mean, we might be willing to talk about how many to put in there, but forget about it. No deal. And during their last conversation, I think it was the 12th of February, 10 days or so before 12 days before the invasion, the last conversation between Biden and Putin, the readout said Biden refused to talk about not putting offensive strike missiles in Ukraine, and he also refused to talk about whether Ukraine would be allowed to come into NATO. So that's the 12th. So what I'm saying here is that the history is pretty sordid, okay? That's what the Russians are interested in. And when Larry referred to the INF treaty, a whole class of medium range, intermediate range ballistic missiles destroyed in place. Scott Ritter, our good friend, was the first inspector on the scene in this awful place called Butkinsk. Okay, 2 years inspecting, make sure that worked. Now what happened? It was Trump that got out of that. Okay, so lastly, I'll just say there is this really bizarre agreement that Olaf Scholz agreed that he would allow the U.S. put offensive strike missiles in Germany starting next year. So reversing completely the INF agreement. Now, when they asked him, Olaf, how'd that come about? You announced it at NATO, but it was just a bilateral agreement. What's going on here? Olaf Scholz said, well, the Americans decided to do this, and they told me about it, and I said, okay. I said, I approved it. So what could happen here is Putin could say, look, this is really crazy. Mr. Trump, you bear some of the responsibility for this misadventure. Let's get back to the INF treaty that you got out of, or something similar, an agreement, not trust, right. An agreement, but verifiable, and we can work that out. And I think that could be worked out. That would be something tangible, as Larry was saying, is necessary. Words don't suffice. Deeds are required.
Well, I had two, Ray, that was great. I had two more topics to cover. Hopefully we can do that, the next half hour, 45 minutes. I wanted to first just say, everybody, please hit the like button as we continue. That helps boost the stream as we move forward, because we're definitely going to talk about what's happening in Yemen toward the end. But first, I wanted to, Glenn, I wanted to talk to you about Europe now, because Europe has very willingly, it looks like a kind of a dog with a leash, but out of control, no less. It is looking to remilitarize. It has promised $800 billion or euros worth of militarization to essentially inherit the Ukraine conflict. That is how Keir Starmer is talking outside of the EU. That's how the EU is talking. I wanted to show you, NATO out of the, when we talk about Europe, when we talk about we talk about defeat and a defeated dog as well. Here is what Mr. Rutte, Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, had to say in relation to future relations with Russia as all of this militarization moves forward. Here we go.
Before you were Secretary General of NATO, you ran a European country. Would you be willing to do business again with Russia after this? Because we are hearing reports of things like maybe gas deals come back into play.
Well, I mean, I'm not there because, first of all, you have to maintain the pressure on the Russians to make sure that they do whatever is necessary. That's why we have the sanctions, and let's not be naive about the Russians. But longer term, Russia is there. I mean, Russia will not go away. And I've had many dealings with President Putin till 2014. In my first 4 years as prime minister, we had many negotiations. And I think it is normal if the war would have stopped for Europe to somehow, step by step, and also for the U.S. step by step, to restore normal relations with the Russians. We are absolutely not there yet. We have to maintain the pressure on them.
So, Glenn, this sounds like a very much a defeated and wounded animal here. But at the same time, what do you make of this push? Even the Donald Trump administration says it. Europe is going to be responsible for its security, but I've heard Hegseth say that security means the Russian threat. So how do you make out what's going on with Europe as it gets cornered deeper and deeper into militarizing?
I guess all over the place at the moment, and it's a bit unclear because only last week we were told that Putin is Hitler, and Russia will, once they're done with Ukraine, they're gonna invade Europe. And suddenly now, a week later, it's, well, once the war is over, Russia's there, we should cooperate. So it doesn't sound like Hitler anymore. So it is a strange shift, but this is kind of what happens with the narratives. They are falling apart very, very quickly. And what's interesting as well is now that the war has been lost, the United States obviously wants to get out of this, and Trump would love to ditch this war on the Europeans, that they can take ownership for this. And the Europeans seem very, very happy to do so because, this illusion that they can fill the shoes of the United States. But this is nonsense. First of all, when the U.S., the Europeans, and the Ukrainians couldn't defeat Russia altogether, the idea that it can take America out of the equation, and somehow now it's going to work also after the Ukrainian army has been destroyed, it doesn't really make any sense. And I know they're talking about rebuilding the military, but this is problematic for many reasons. All of these plans they have, it would take years, if not decades, to actually build up the capabilities they're dreaming of. And furthermore, as Larry pointed out earlier, the key resources we need, the rare earth minerals, antimony, for example, the Chinese have almost a complete monopoly on it, not just the mining, but the refining. And they now put restrictions on it because I think it's about, within the antimony, I think they only produce about 2/3 of global demand. So why would they send it to the countries which are threatening them? It doesn't really make any sense. So that's the weapons. But also, how are they going to fund this at all? I mean, we had now for many years very expensive COVID. We had expensive Green New Deal. And this was when the interest rates were low. Now they're high. It's very difficult to service this debt. Where's exactly the money going to come from? Keep in mind that much of Europe is in deep economic problems now. Germany, which had its industries, especially the energy-intensive industries, very, very dependent on Russia, has seen that the sanctions, joined by the destruction of Nord Stream, has led to the deindustrialization of Germany. And what remains of its weak industries are being now brought over with this Inflation Reduction Act, where they have subsidies for moving across. Otherwise, China's also coming for it as well. So there's no money, there's no weapons, there's no political unity either. Without the U.S. there, the Europeans tend to drift in each direction. I think this was already obvious when the Europeans met in Paris. They were supposed to show unity. It was, well, I don't have to go into it, but it was anything but unity. So, they all have their own interest. Macron, he would like, if we have a militarized EU, then leadership would go to France. And he's kind of been the Napoleon that nobody wants to follow. So this could be a way for him. Then you have the British, who see their main link to former glory being the junior partner of America. They would like to step into this role. But again, it's fantasy land. They don't have anything. They can't fight the Russians. Indeed, when Starmer was meeting with Trump, and Trump said, can the British take on the Russians? I mean, the whole room burst into laughter. It's a punchline. It's a joke. So this is not great. So there's huge problems. And I think the core of the problem for the Europeans is they keep looking at this as if we're still in Russiagate years, that this is some kind of trumping weak on Russia, that is charity. But as already been said here, this is not giving away anything. Ukraine and NATO lost the war. It's over, and you have two ways to go now. Either if there is no peace, then there's going to be a collapse of the Ukrainian army, and the Russians can then do what they want, or NATO can escalate. But as then Trump warned, this would mean World War III. And even if you wanted to escalate, well, what exactly would it mean? There's no hidden weapon storages anywhere. Biden would have sent that already. As Michael Rubio said, we're already sanctioned out. And the Russians have too many advantages. They have the logistics, given the proximity. They have the weapons. They have them in industrial capacity. And also, quite important, they want it more. This is, for them, they see this as an existential threat. They're willing to go all the way on this. And even if we're able to avoid World War III and everything, going after the Russians like this is only going to push them closer and closer to China, which is also not in the U.S. interest. So there's no one's assessing the rationality. I think it's panic, because for 80 years, Europe has been now glued to the United States. We outsourced our security and our strategic thinking. And now that, the U.S. is seen to take a step away, everyone seems to be running around like headless chickens. They're a bit uncertain how to respond to this. And there's no strategic thinking. There's no rationale. It's just this knee-jerk reaction. So, it's quite chaotic. If you follow the European media, it's a very strange place at the moment.
Yeah, Larry, I want to bring you in because when I heard that Europe wants to spend 800 billion plus euros, essentially militarizing itself, like the United States has militarized itself, the first thought was, well, the United States is militarizing in this way has caused a lot of problems, not least endless war. Talk about your reaction to how Europe has responded, and NATO in particular has responded to these ongoing talks between the U.S. and Russia, but also just the continuation of the conflict amid these talks, which it seems to have, as Glenn said, caused a great panic in Western Europe in particular.
NATO and Europe, I think, like conceive of themselves as being part of one great orchestra. But what it really is what I would call an orchestral fantasy. Because instead of, let's say that Germany would represent the trumpets and the tubas, and that the French would represent the strings, and the Italians represent the wind instruments, the oboes, the clarinets. The Brits are banging the drums. The Poles are doing the cymbals. But they can all come together under one director and play beautiful music. That's not what we have, okay? What you got is Britain's the rap group. The French are doing the blues. The Italians are trying to do classical music. The Germans are doing oompa. And the Poles are, drinking beer and playing accordions. And they try to bring that all together and say they don't even have the same sheet of music. Plus, the instruments are a real poor quality. So they're a joke. They're a potentially malevolent, violent joke, but they've got no staying power to sustain military operations. Even, when you start totaling up the numbers, the actual German army size is 63,000. Now they start counting up all the Bundeswehr, bringing it up to maybe 160,000. But the reality is the actual army for Germany, 63,000, and they're not even properly equipped with where every soldier has a functioning rifle. England, similar situation, 70,000. Hell, you would have to bring the German and British armies together to fill maybe a major football stadium in Germany or in England. I'm not sure what Manchester United seats. It's a little over 100,000. So you've got these are I'll call them fantasy moments for each of these countries. They're talking about this is what we're going to do without actually sitting down and recognizing that they don't have the money in the bank account. And it is without the money, without the industrial plants, without the actual raw materials from which to produce these weapon systems. They're not going to come up with anything. And what we're ignoring is that the inventories in each of these major countries, in Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, have been stripped, and they're not being replaced. There's not a great supply all lined up, ready to flood back into the empty warehouses. So the European Union and NATO, they're having to come to grips that they're no longer relevant. They're no longer a relevant player in international affairs. The age of the domination of the colonialists is over, and we're now in it, witnessing the death rattle that is coming out of Germany, coming out of France, coming out of England. They couldn't, to be charitable, they couldn't organize a 3-car funeral if you put 2 cars in line, because they would be arguing, do we want an electrical vehicle or a petrol vehicle? Should it be front-wheel drive, rear-wheel drive, 4-wheel drive? Should it have 2 doors or 4 doors? Should it, what color is it going to be? They couldn't agree on any of it. That's the state of Europe and NATO, in my view.
Mm-hmm. Ray, yeah, your comments on this.
No, I just want to praise my colleague Larry for his use of metaphors. I think the orchestra and no common sheet of music speaks volumes. There's something really ironic that has happened here. Number one, the Soviet Union fell apart. Number two, the Soviet Union, having fallen apart, was no threat to anybody. They had no army to speak of. Putin came in, tried to do a deal, no deal from the West, and Putin built up the Russian army. Whoa. What's the difference now? For the first time in my adult life, the Russians are more strong in everything except ICBMs, in every except strategic missiles. And that counts for a lot. They have Oreshnik, hypersonic missiles that can wreak incredible damage and for which there is no defense. And they have the army in Europe now, such as Larry expected. It has no rival now. If you want to be afraid of the Russians, this is the time to be afraid of them. because they're armed to the teeth. They have incredible battle experience. They have these intermediate range ballistic missiles that there's no defense against. Well, okay, be afraid of the Russians, but realize that you brought it on, you guys. What one prominent Russian official called the pygmies that control Europe. Now, you brought it on. Now, what's the come to Jesus moment? $800 billion? What does that mean? You're going to make people work until they're 80 or 86, like I am? What are you going to do for social? But what do you do? So, as soon as the Europeans realize that this whole business about a threat from Russia was a chimera, was crazy, okay? And you started saying, well, now there is a threat for Russia, but let's deal, okay? Let's not, okay, here's a factoid. Yesterday, I learned Volkswagen, they built a lot of tanks and stuff for Germany back when I was just born, right? They're going to build tanks for the Bundeswehr now. Just announced, the CEO of Volkswagen said, yeah, we're going to build arms. We're not going to build any more cars. My God, okay. Maybe they'll build them in China or else they're going to build them in. I mean, hello, does that speak volumes or what? So there is a profiteer here, and that is the military-industrial complex. That explains in large measure, in my view, why the woman heading the EU, that Lavrov, when he was talking to Larry and the judge, said, Führer von der Leyen. There's no German negative no German feminine for Führer, or else he would have said Führerin Ursula von der Leyen. But there's no reasoning with people like her, and she, of course, like all those bureaucrats, are on the take. So it's going to take a while, but it will be sure economics that will wreak havoc on these pygmies to say, well, we'll be thrown out of office if we cut social benefits so that they're as bad as they are in the U.S. I mean, our people like medical care. America, they can get away with that. So, in other words, when reality comes into the fore, these guys are going to be out, and a more sensible crew is going to come in and relax. The Russians don't want to take over Europe anymore. They'll leave Europe to its own devices. All they want is a secure border and some respect for their concerns about an armed NATO nation right on their border.
Before we move on, I wanted to get you and Glenn one last time on this subject, because Ray is saying sheer economics will absolutely devastate Europe and be the breaking point. How do you see this going for Europe? Because I certainly see a scenario. When I hear von der Leyen, when I hear, I always forget her name, the top EU diplomat, Kalis, I don't know how to say her name.
Kallas.
Kallis. When I hear these people talk, I believe that they are serious about, regardless, you mentioned earlier that it probably is not going to work out well for Europe. I do believe that they're going to put this into policy, and essentially, regardless of what happens between U.S., Russia, Trump, Russia, peace negotiations, they will attempt to assume responsibility for this encroachment and war on Russia. And I'm curious about what the consequences you believe will be, given what Ray just said.
Well, I think if we look at it rationally, there's not much Europe can do. So, if you assume that the policymakers are rational, then everything will be fine. But as I mentioned before, I don't see much reason anymore. I see a huge decoupling from reality, and I also the concern goes beyond Ukraine, because what's being signaled from the United States is it would like to pivot a bit back to the Western Hemisphere and to Asia, and Europe is being deprioritized. So not only is U.S. pulling out of Ukraine, but they would like to also reduce their presence in Europe. And this is a almost collapse of Europe's status, because in the 90s we thought we were going to be one of the two pillars of the collective West, which would enjoy global hegemony in the world. And suddenly we put all our eggs in the American basket, and America has better things to do. And we're not even going to be a proper pole of power in a multipolar world. So there seems to be a lot at stake here. And with the absence of strategic thinking, everyone's speaking in cliches and doing this emotional speeches and shaming. This is another problem, by the way, because in Europe we have all these countries, and as Larry pointed out, very different. The way we usually obtain common position is we frame everything as being good or bad. So whenever we have European integration, it's either you're for Europe or you're against Europe. They frame it. So either you're for freedom or you're against freedom. Or in Ukraine, either you stand up to Hitler or you send all your weapons. So we painted ourselves in a corner with this crazy rhetoric, and we're at the point now where the political leaders actually don't see any alternatives. They're quite panicking. So this is why I'm saying, if it was just reason, it would be one thing, but it's not reason anymore. So I think the Europeans could do something foolish if there's not any pathways which would be acceptable. And keep in mind, when they're very upset with Trump for wanting to end the war, they don't have any actual alternatives. The best thing they could come up with was what Macron suggested, which was, let's do a temporary ceasefire, but only for the sky from the sea, and also no attacks on energy infrastructure. So all the areas where Russia dominates, let's stop there. You can still kill each other at ground, but the Russians, you're not allowed to have any air support. And what's it going to achieve? Well, we're not going to concede on anything politically. We're just going to do this for 30 days. And the whole point of it is for Putin to show his good faith. And it's very strange. We have von der Leyen giving speeches that we should set up tribunals against Putin, which is very strange. Usually, it's the losing, it's the winning part in a war, which starts to put the other ones on trials. We're losing, and but the more things change on the ground, the further they withdraw into their narratives. It's quite remarkable, and again, if you've seen over the past few years now, there's been all this peace summit always from Netherlands to Switzerland, Denmark to Switzerland, and it's always the same format. It's a peace summit. They don't invite the Russians. They don't discuss Russian security. Instead, the last time in Switzerland, you had President Duda of Poland, who suggested we should break up Russia into 200 smaller countries because Russia is a prison and a prison for nations, he said. And Kaja Kallas, the EU foreign policy chief, she also said that she doesn't actually believe in the diplomacy because Putin is a war criminal, and she doesn't talk to war criminals, which is a very strange thing to come from the chief diplomat. She also, by the way, said that it would be better if Russia would be defeated, so it could be broken into many smaller states. So when the Russians say they see this as an existential threat, it's not so much paranoia or being crazy. It's more, citing the actual people on the other side. So I think this is there's reasons to be concerned because the Europeans, they don't seem to want to go along with anything. And part of the reason is they also withdrew a lot from reality. That is, they're still talking that Russia's taking many more casualties than Ukrainians. The front lines are now stopped. They're not moving. You can look at Kursk collapsing, the worst humiliation and defeat, and they're like, yeah, mission accomplished. It's they're still there. I mean, it's really withdrawn into fantasy land. There's some bunker mentality going on, and no, I think this is going to be a challenge for Trump as well. He has to control the Europeans. He has to give them something to make them accept the peace as well. But we're still talking about NATO expanding and security guarantees, and Britain developing a coalition of the willing. This is probably the most unfortunate phrasing as well from those of us who remember the Iraq War. I mean, are we really going to do this against the world's largest nuclear power? It's and without the Americans, it's I don't know. It's very concerning to me, though.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Well, let's move on to, I wanted to close today with the announcement by the Trump administration, by Donald Trump himself, that there is a new military operation on the way, actually here now, against Yemen, Ansar Allah. This is what Donald Trump had to say. He said, quote, "Your time is up. Your attacks must stop starting today. If they don't, hell will rain upon you like nothing you have ever seen before." Well, the United States and the United Kingdom right now are conducting airstrikes. So far, I believe Yemen has said 18, but I'm sure there are more that have been killed. Now, this is in response, and I want to get you in here, Larry, to Ansar Allah just a few days to a week ago announcing that it was restarting its naval blockade of the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, and targeting Israeli and, of course, Israeli affiliated vessels sailing through that economic corridor. So, Larry, your reaction to this, because it seems like Trump hasn't been in office for too long now. This is only a couple months in. And part of the response from Ansar Allah to restart the blockade was because about 4 or 5 Palestinians a day are being killed and aid has been stopped completely in Gaza. So your thoughts about what's going on here and its implications?
Well, Trump's hopes of portraying himself as the guy who's going to bring peace around the world has just gone down and been flushed down the toilet. Trump's going to learn a hard lesson out of this, whether he likes it or not. His bombast, "Oh, I'm going to rain hell down on you." He's foolish enough to think that the Biden administration was pulling punches and was just doing love taps on the Houthis, that they weren't launching serious military operations. He's going to discover that they're the greatest, so-called greatest military in the world ain't so great, ain't so powerful, and ain't so effective. The efforts to stop mobile launch missiles in Yemen is going to be a fool's errand for Trump, because no matter how sophisticated the U.S. intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities are, they're not good enough to detect where those mobile missile platforms are. And on top of it, the Houthis have already shot down 500 million, almost $500 million worth of Global Hawks. These drones, they're like go at $30-40 million a pop. The Houthis have been shooting them down repeatedly over the last 15 months. So this is Donald Trump trying to flex muscles, and again, stupidly believing that with threats, with violence, that he's going to stop the Houthis. Well, I judge based upon past experience, the Houthis are very tough customers, and it's going to be impossible for the United States to, quote, defeat them short of wiping them out with a nuclear weapon. Now, I mean, I'm not suggesting that should happen. That's an extreme statement, but the conventional means that the United States are going to use are going to be limited. And in fact, if he's dumb enough to reinsert an aircraft carrier into the Red Sea along with some cruisers and destroyers, they're going to wind up, this time, one of them is going to get sunk. And so all of a sudden, Donald Trump's going to sit there having lost, being blamed for losing a major ship. So this is, and why is this happening? Because the Trump administration is completely bought and subservient to the Zionist lobby. And they have, instead of pursuing an honest, straightforward peace negotiation, have chosen to side with the extremist Zionists. They fired the chief negotiator for Trump the other day because he had the audacity to treat the Hamas folks like they were human beings. And so now, with Israel engaging in more genocidal war crimes by trying to cut off all electricity, food, and water to the people of Gaza, the Houthis finally stood up and said, we're going to fight back. At least the Houthis will stand up on behalf of the people of Palestine, in contrast to the rest of the Arab world.
And Ray, and then I think that was the perfect summation, Larry. And Ray, when Ansar Allah, when the Houthis say they're going to do something, they do it. And you mentioned already, the United States does not have hypersonic missiles, yet Ansar Allah does. And so they've promised during these airstrikes already that there's going to be a response, and I can bet everything I have, whatever that is not much, but everything I have on that occurring. So, Ray, where do you see things going, and any response you have to what Larry was saying as well?
Well, I think Larry is quite right in pointing out that the Houthis are not easily challenged or easily obliterated. What I would say is that I find it really ironic. I mean, the Houthis are against genocide. They do what they say they're going to do, and that is blockade the Red Sea until the genocide stops. I, Ray McGovern, think that's a good idea. Does that make me a follower of the Houthis? No, it doesn't. But it's ironic that I happen to agree with what they're doing. You know, the stakes are really high here. We are talking about genocide, and the United States government not only enabling it, but arming it and making it possible. That dwarfs every other consideration, in my view. And Larry is right. It's the Zionist lobby that's helping this to happen. Well, what was I going to say? Yeah. The other thing is this asymmetrical warfare, right? I made a little note to myself. Oh, isn't that interesting? Yeah, asymmetrical. These damn Houthis, they don't have the big things like we do, like global hawks and other things to make sure they have good intelligence. Okay, well, yeah, but they have the wherewithal. They have the sense of justice that makes them asymmetrical in terms of what the United States is. In the United States, in this administration and the one before it, has a very, very peculiar sense of justice when it comes to people who don't look like us, like the Palestinians or the people that the Israelis don't like. So asymmetrical, yeah. And isn't it bizarre that one finds himself associated with what the Houthis are trying to do to prevent this from keeping going by blockading? That's not a, it's against international law, but it's certainly not bombing blocks, entire blocks of people in Gaza or in the West Bank. So that's what I would say to this. Trump is acting in a very crazy way, much more crazy with respect to these developments in Southwest Asia than he is in Ukraine. The only slimmer and the only glimmer of hope that I have is that if he succeeds in working out some sort of peaceful arrangement with respect to Russia and Ukraine, well, maybe he'll think that maybe he could act as his own man here and put the Israel lobby in its place and stop the carnage. I don't think he wants to go down as Genocide Joe or Genocide Donald. Okay, so
Right.
what was I going to say about Donald? Yeah, Donald. Well, okay, fair enough. I'll end on that. But I feel real strong about this. It's not a matter of intelligence. It's a matter of justice, and it's a matter of what the U.S. is enabling.
Yeah, Glenn, let me bring you in here because when Donald Trump was elected, he immediately went for a ceasefire in Gaza. He pushed through a May 2024 deal, which Joe Biden decided to conveniently let completely fall through. And part of that reasoning, in my estimation, was because Donald Trump did not want in the beginning of his administration to enter into what had been occurring there, which was a growing regional war that had many different fronts that the United States seemed very hapless in responding to. And it was honestly creating a very dire situation even for Israel as time went on and on. So now with this bombing of Ansarallah, that threat of this all reemerging and the fighting, it was already a threadbare in Gaza and Lebanon too, continuing again. So what do you make of this, the geopolitical significance of this in particular, not just for the Trump administration, but globally?
Well, I think that his instincts were right. That is, that he doesn't want all these forever wars in the Middle East. Unfortunately, this is also combined with standing uncritically with Israel, no matter what it does, because as long as there's no Palestinian state, there's no solution. Then either this apartheid or there's ethnic cleansing or genocide, but there has to be something. You can't have a ethno-nation state in which half the population are your ethnicity or your religious group. So because of this, I think the instability within Palestine and the other neighboring countries is going to draw the United States into the region. So we would have to address the source of the conflict. And I very much agree with what was said. That is, if you don't address these issues, you can't just say, well, we want to uphold freedom of navigation. And I would say, yes, well, that's a great principle. But when the blockade is in a direct response to a genocide, which no one is wanting to stand up against in the West, anyone who can put pressure on Israel, then this has to happen in a vacuum. And I think this is the most important thing, because we do love the war unprovoked in Ukraine. And I think the same idea is applied here, because if it comes out of nowhere, of course, then such reactions will be reasonable. But it does come from somewhere. And also, I'm not sure to what extent this could be successful as well. As Larry said as well, these are not just mobile launchers, but they have a lot of stuff underground. And in regards to the asymmetrical warfare, it's also worth noting that you don't always need the most expensive and best missiles. If you have the quantity and good enough weapons, which are cheap, the mere efforts of intercepting these weapons and it would drain the resources of the United States and any partners who wants to join there. And I guess my a key concern also is this tendency to make big threats and talk a big game. At times it works. again put the pressure on Panama. They immediately bent to pressure. They abandoned Belt and Road Initiative, made concessions to the U.S. on passage in the Panama Canal. It worked with the Colombians, and well, across the board you have countries who are willing to bow to pressure. But what happens in a situation like this when they're not going to bow, and seems to be quite obvious. They're not going to move away. Well, what happens then? Because now Trump has, well, he called it his war fighters who has been sent, and they will, rain death and destruction on them unless they do as they're told. What happens when it doesn't work? When the response becomes ineffective, becomes too expensive, as was mentioned before, if the U.S. would lose a ship, how is Trump going to react then? Is he going to accept defeat? So it's very difficult to walk back these massive statements. I'll give it to Trump. He has a tendency to be able to get away with almost everything, but of course this is the practical issues. I also think this is a problem with the justice issue here, the morality, because this is not simply a good guy versus terrorists. There's obviously some other problems. The genocide. This is why this is happening, and if we're not able to resolve or respond to the issues in Palestine, then all of this is going to be bombing away at the symptoms, which is just going to make things much, much worse.
Yeah, and Larry, Donald Trump also had threats for Iran in this announcement of the military operation. Oftentimes, Ansar Allah is seen as just an Iranian proxy. Trump has also threatened Iran, even though he signaled that he wants some kind of negotiations. But he's also threatened Iran with military provocations should it essentially not do what the United States wants. So are we witnessing now, with the launch of this military operation, the beginning once again of this powder keg that had been raging throughout essentially the last year and a half of the Biden administration, once again restarting? Because, as I said before, I believe that Yemen will strike back, and there also is this problem of at any moment Israel could use any of these potential flashpoints as an excuse to continue fighting, which there's a lot of pressure inside of Israel to do.
Well, if you would have asked me 3 weeks ago, I was voicing some optimism that perhaps Trump, by virtue of not having to face another election, and despite having received significant funds from Zionist supporters, such as the widow of a Las Vegas tycoon, that he was actually going to chart a more rational course. And this the negotiator that was appointed to deal with Hamas appeared to fall in line with that. Well, I was wrong, completely wrong. Trump has fallen into the Zionist trap, and he can rattle sabers all he wants. He can thump his chest. He can scream and holler. And if he decides to launch military attacks on Iran, the United States will face a defeat. I'll predict that right now, that the United States is going to discover that Iran is not some weak, vulnerable country. Trump apparently is ignoring the fact that just right now, as we speak, Iran is conducting joint military naval exercises with China and Russia for the 5th year. This is not something recent. This isn't being done just because of the latest developments. These things are planned 12 to 18 months out. So it's part of a reflection of the change that Iran has now realized that it's got to work with China and Russia to secure itself. And then the fact that Russia and Iran signed that important security arrangement on January 17th, 3 days before Trump was inaugurated, that wasn't just a coincidence. That was designed to send a message to the West, a message that Trump isn't hearing. So, yeah, I think we're entering very dangerous waters. This Trump's submission to the Zionists, these murderers, these genocidal maniacs, call them what you want, but his surrendering to them is going to be the death of his presidency. It will bring about failure and collapse for him, because he's going to have to end up explaining the loss of military personnel to these, so-called inferior countries. I mean, good God, they want to bomb the Houthis back into the 14th century. They already live in the 14th century, except they've got hypersonic missiles, as Roy pointed out.
Yeah, well, yeah, they live in the 14th century because of they've been fighting a Saudi-led, U.S. also backed war there for so many years that decimated the country. Absolutely. Just before we were talking about Gaza, we were talking about the humanitarian nightmare that the Yemeni people live in, and yet they continue to fight. And Ray, I wanted to bring you in here for perhaps the last word, although I'll definitely have maybe Glenn also chime in to maybe give a wrap up. But I wanted to ask you, given all these threats toward Iran, what I've noticed is over this period of 16 plus months now of just an absolute nightmare situation for Gaza, we've also witnessed a number of critical setbacks for the United States as the hegemon there. Not just Iran's military operations that were launched twice in response, but Yemen as well, Ansarallah, which is going to respond to these attacks, showed immense defiance and strength. And then even just people of Gaza and Palestine continuing to fight, despite the horrific massacres that they were experiencing. I mean, I have been saying this since Donald Trump was elected. Like, if this explodes again, I 100% agree with Larry. Donald Trump and everything that came with them, the whole MAGA, the Republican resurgence, all of this could go away very quick, very, very, very quickly. By the next congressional election, it could be wiped out. Ray, what is your take on where this is all taking us?
Well, one question I have is the Houthis, Al Ansarallah. Is their courage contagious? How about those cowardly Arab leaders who just complain about Israel and what Israel is doing, and it's doing genocide, not only in Gaza now, but on the left bank itself? I think there's a growing chance that even these cowardly Arab nations will be edified by these primitive Houthis and start to exert a little pressure on Israel that they've been unwilling to do before. With respect to Iran, the key here that I would look for would be some neocon or some Wall Street Journal or Fiona Hill type saying, there's evidence now that the Iranians are working on a nuclear weapon. Okay, now we have to zap them. Okay, what's the problem with that? Well, in 2007, when Bush and Cheney were just about to authorize a joint operation to take care of Iran, so to speak, on their last year out, right? The intelligence community came up with an assessment that Iran stopped working on a nuclear weapon at the end of 2003 and had not resumed. Unanimous agreement on that, expressed with good confidence and released by Congress. That stopped the war against Iran that Bush and Cheney fully intended to wage. You can read George W. Bush's memoir, and he says, this deprived me of the military option for how could I authorize a strike on the nuclear facilities of a country that the intelligence community tells me has no active nuclear weapons program. Now, the judgment first voiced at the end in November of 2007 has been revoiced or reiterated every year since. But if you see somebody saying now, somebody from Foreign Affairs or some neocon say, oh, now they're working on a nuclear weapon, Netanyahu was right all along. He's been saying this for years, right? Okay. Then I would worry. Until then, I think we can relax. The more so since Russia and Iran have almost a military agreement here. It's just short of a mutual defense treaty. And as I understand it, U.S. people are talking to the Iranians, unlike before. In other words, they talk to these adversaries. I don't think that's going to happen. I surely hope it doesn't. That's my best guess.
And Glenn, maybe finally, just your the final take on where the Middle East situation, now that there is once again the relaunch of a U.S.-led military operation there. Your take on where things are going, because there's so many hot points. We didn't even get into Syria, but it is going to shape things to come for the United States. A lot of talk on Ukraine, but I feel like we're going to be talking about the Middle East and West Asia a lot in the coming days and weeks ahead.
Well, I guess, just make 2 points. The first, related to what Ray was speaking about, which was the weakness of the other leaders in the region. Because keep in mind that not that long ago, people in the region did not seem to care that much about the Houthis at all. But now, of course, many are frustrated by the governments, which seem to do nothing. And meanwhile, the Houthis, who's standing up to this almost alone, has gained much respect. So there's a problem here that a lot of the solidarity and obedience that the U.S. and Israel gets from a lot of the neighbors, it's actually a weakness as well, because it could fuel instability within the countries. You can have problems emerging from Egypt or in Jordan. So this is a big big problem if this can continue to go on for too long. And this is just on the local level. Also on the more the global spectrum of things. You have an entry of other great powers as well. That is China, Russia. All of these countries are now having greater interest in the region. And my second point is that Israel itself, it's in very deep trouble at the moment. It has not only exhausted itself to a large extent, fighting Hamas, fighting Hezbollah, and of course occupying Syria. There's a lot of problems now. The army reports on this, and not only have they exhausted themselves in the fighting, but also internally. There's a lot of internal divisions now within Israel, and again, there seems to be more of a consensus there that the only way to get Israel out of all of this, that is to resolve the issues of the external threats as well as backing up the current government, is to bring in America closer. So if you can get the Americans joining a war against Iran, this is something that could resolve all of Israel's problems, because many problems are building up. The only problem here is that the war on Iran will be a complete disaster. The country is huge, it's powerful. The idea that all the Iranians are just waiting to take to the streets and topple the government and praise America for bombing their country, with missiles of freedom. This is also fantasy. Furthermore, they're going to get backed by other large powers. You mentioned Russia, but also China, if not militarily, at least, well, not directly, but nonetheless, they have formed a closer and closer relations, economic, political, and also military cooperation. So they're not going to just stand by and do nothing. So I think this is the biggest mistake Trump could do if he accepts to join in on a war against Iranians. And if you can convince him that the Houthis are simply doing Iran's bidding, then this could be a logical pathway. But this is also, I think, a very flawed premise. That is, yes, they are allied. Yes, they are both consider themselves part of the resistance against the Zionists, but this is it. Even they do have some autonomy. They have their own policies. This is, if they get roped in going after Iran, I think this would be an incredible disaster, the worst one. I mean, this is not Iraq. This is not Afghanistan. Iran is something very, very different. So I would be, concerned if Trump would go this direction.
Gentlemen, I've kept you longer than we had previously agreed to. So apologies for that, but I think it was a great conversation. I'm just going to pull the super chats up while I talk. So thank you for everyone who gave super chats. But I wanted to just thank you all for joining me today. We can leave together. I wanted to point everyone to the video description where you can find Ray's X account, where you can follow his work. I have Glenn Diesen, your YouTube channel. It is below, as well as Larry Johnson, your Countercurrents YouTube channel is there. So everyone be sure to check that out as you leave. Be sure to hit the like button as you leave as well, because that helps keep the stream going. You can leave a comment too. That helps keep the video getting pushed out so that more people can see it. Do consider supporting in the video description as well the work here on Patreon or Substack. That helps keep everything going as we move forward, building more alternative and independent media to cover these topics in ways that the mainstream media and even much of alternative media won't do. So everyone, thank you so much for tuning in. I'll be back soon. Larry, Ray, Glenn, we'll have to do this again. This was, I think, a really good conversation. Thanks again.
Thank
Most
you,
welcome.
and farewell to everybody. Bye.
All right. Farewell, everybody.